Hi. It's always difficult to give a lecture without an audience. And of course, this is the first time that I will give a lecture without an audience for the Critical Theory Summer School. I have been involved with this excellent school since its very inception, except for the last 2 years when I was involved with politics. And I hope that we will survive this major crisis, and next year we will come back in full and glorious physical face-to-face version. Now, my talk will be on biopolitics, rights, and the state of exception. And as you know, for the last 10 years, we have been through three major crises: the economic, then the crisis with refugees, now the pandemic, all, of course, against the background of the climate catastrophe. In all three cases, governments have activated their powers to impose a state of exception beyond the normal operation of constitutional law. They have violated all or most civil, political, and socio-economic rights and have seriously restricted democracy. Now, the crisis, every crisis, brings to the surface the taken for granted, invisible preconditions of thought and action, which define the ways we see the world in normal times. This therefore helps us to review them and perhaps even change our course. What I'm going to do in this talk is to examine the state of exception for the insights it gives us in the change in relationship between power and citizens in late capitalism. I will start with the treatment of refugees in Greece recently and currently, then move on to the pandemic and conclude with some more general remarks about death, dying, and resistance. This talk will develop the critical legal approach that is being presented in many books, and also my recent book entitled The Radical Philosophy of Rights. So first part, refugees and the state of exception. On May 6, President Erdogan of Turkey opened the doors to refugees to go to Europe via Greece. It was an attempt to put pressure on the European Union and get various concessions from them that were unrelated to the question of migration. Thousands of refugees and migrants were bused by the Turkish authorities to the border between Greece and Turkey and the western coastline. 1,000 special operations police were sent to prevent Greek authorities from returning people, preventing people or returning them when they managed to cross. The Greek authorities responded in kind. They sent elite troops and riot police to the border. When some people tried to get into the country, they used tear gas, water cannons, and other measures to repel them, with Turkish forces firing volleys of tear gas in return. There are reports that at least one refugee was killed by the Greek police, and that the port police has been sinking refugee boats, these little dinghies they use to cross the Aegean, and also pushbacks, pushing those boats back when they enter Greek waters, with serious risk, of course, of loss of life, of sinking the boats. The government stopped at the same time processing asylum applications in a clear violation of the Geneva Convention and international law. It discontinued the payment of a small allowance to those in the country, refugees in the country, and evicted them from their homes, those who had homes and had been given a political asylum. At the end of May, the Turkish foreign minister stated that the Greek state must get rid of its barbarism. It must respect the rights of asylum seekers, not torture and abuse them. The Greeks bounced back the accusation. Those condemned by the international community for instrumentalizing human suffering for the sake of political expediency are obviously not entitled to teach human rights. Now, I don't need to say much about the human rights situation in Turkey. The 2020 Human Rights Watch report accuses the country of gross human rights abuses with a dramatic decline in the rule of law and democracy. Thousands of civil servants have been fired, journalists and academics have been jailed, politicians have been expelled from parliament and imprisoned. The Greek government, on the other hand, proved its respect for refugees' rights by imposing measures that amounted to a state of exception. Even before these events, the right-wing Greek government had housed refugees in the Aegean Islands in overcrowded centers unfit for human habitation. With the start of the pandemic, these became closed prison-like camps and the living conditions became unbearable. When the lockdown was eased in Greece in late May, the camps remained closed. In early June, the government asked the European Union to introduce an emergency clause, a permanent emergency clause in the immigration and refugee law, allowing the state to suspend the asylum processes and to return refugees entering the country without even registering them. All this is clearly illegal. Greece is asking the Europeans to legalize the state of exception they had already imposed against existing European and Greek law. Greece against Turkey, one sovereign accusing another of cruelty and barbarity. Rights, instead of protecting the vulnerable, have become sovereign weapons against the enemy. What about the people in the middle? The refugees at the border do not have rights under Greek or Turkish law, but are supposedly protected by the Geneva Convention and human rights. Let me remind you here Hannah Arendt's famous and bitter comment about the plight of refugees and the stateless in the interwar period, when, of course, no international human rights law or Geneva Convention existed. Arendt writes, if a man loses his political status, he should, according to the claims of the natural and inalienable rights of man, to come under their protection. In fact, the opposite is true. A man who is nothing more than a man, bare life as she calls it elsewhere, has lost those qualities that make others treat him like a fellow human being. This is exactly what is happening still today, despite the plethora of international treaties, rights, and protections. They exist in theory, but not in practice. Let me generalize. We are told that we have human rights just because we are human. The refugee predicament shows that this is not the case. Every age and every country has its own definition of humanity, which distinguishes between the fully human, the lesser human, and the inhuman or the excluded. Those who do not speak our language, do not share our religion, our class, gender, color, or sexuality stay out of humanity, are excluded from humanity as locally defined. This leads me to the first thesis of this talk, and I will have, I think, 3 or 4. We do not have human rights because we're human. On the contrary, we're more or less human depending on how many and what rights we have. It is a question of political struggle, not of law. Let me now move to the request of the Greek government that the EU legislates a state of exception clause. It is both ridiculous and scary. Ridiculous. The emergency, the exception, is something unpredictable and sudden, something by definition outside of law. The law cannot and has never prevented the political decision to impose a state of exception and violate legality. But similarly, the law cannot authorize it. The emergency and the state of exception take place, happen in the real, not the symbolic. They belong to fact and power, not to law and norms. A legalized state of exception is a contradiction in terms. It is like the Constitution guaranteeing the right to revolution and the right to its own overthrow. But at the same time, this farcical request is scary. Refugees are used to make the exception permanent and extended throughout the territory. It's not only that the state gives rights and can suspend or withhold them. Rights are the way in which the sovereign confirms its power over the other sovereigns and over its own citizens. The refugees are the vanishing mediator in this antagonism between the states. The second thesis. According to a famous statement by Carl Schmitt, the sovereign is he who imposes the state of emergency in order to save the socio-political system. I paraphrase. Refugees exist to give the sovereign the power to impose the state of exception. The exceptional becomes normal, first for victimized target groups, then for the whole population. Let me move now to part 2, biopolitics and the state of exception. In the pandemic, we experience all over the world the awkward combination of sovereignty and biopolitics, of government and governance. The term that represents the articulation best is immunity, a term developed by Italian philosopher Roberto Esposito. Immunity, the term immunity, has two meanings: protection from disease, but also protection from the state, given to certain groups of citizens, like members of parliament, ministers, and diplomats, who enjoy immunity from criminal prosecution for certain crimes. Similarly, the asylum given to refugees is a form of immunity, protection from being sent back to the country they are fleeing from. Indeed, etymologically, the word asylum means absence and protection from injury and damage. These are restricted forms of a more general citizen immunity that developed in modernity. The theories of natural law and social contract in the 17th century were a reaction to the absolute power of the state. They led to the introduction of limitations on government power organized by the state itself. The purpose was to create a legally guaranteed zone of citizen activity and protection that governments could not breach. Now, the dominant view of sovereignty is based on a binary scheme, with power on the one hand and citizens on the other, mediated by legal rights. The state creates rights, and law, the language of the state, implements them. Government restrictions are organized by the state itself. For liberalism, law and politics, the rule and the exception, norm and fact appear as opposing poles. The sovereign-citizen relationship is presented as a zero-sum game. The more rights we have, the more limited the power of the state. Rights, the right to life, the right to movement, or the right to speech, offer immunity from state intervention. But this dual relationship was unsettled by biopolitics, a form of power which manages populations and groups, not individuals and rights. Biopolitics, and here I'm following, of course, the analysis of Michel Foucault, the classical analysis of Michel Foucault, as developed by Deleuze, by Hard and Negri, and of course by Esposito himself. Biopolitics controls and disciplines life and biological functions and targets social groups according to general characteristics such as gender, race, age, occupation, or ethnicity. It manages births and deaths, health and skills, risk and well-being. The limited socioeconomic rights of the social state after the Second World War are concessions to citizen struggles, but also instruments of population management. Biopolitics treats the population not as legal persons with rights, but as economically active individuals. Utility, not rights. Economic and social policy, rather than law, determine the logic of governance, which follows the economic calculations of Homo economicus and of governmental economic policy. In this setting, freedom is no longer the exercise of fundamental rights, but the autonomy of citizens to pursue their interests. The job of the government is to create the right environment for the exercise and coordination of private interests through two supposedly neutral mechanisms: the market and law. Limits to government action now are not exclusively legal, but real. The two forms of state power, government and governance, become combined. The sovereign government deals with public safety, the defense of the realm, monetary and economic stability. Biopolitics and governance deals with economic efficiency and the biological existence and prosperity of the population, with demographic, health, education, and work policies. We, the subjects of late capitalism, have a dual existence too. We're legal persons with rights and protections from government interference, but also insignificant group members and targets of state policy. These strategies inscribe the needs, desires, and hopes that make us feel free, productive, and creative. So we're unique and unrepeatable legal persons, but at the same time, formally equal and similar with others. The biopolitical subject is a person with legal rights, protecting from arbitrariness, but also a member of a group subjected to statistical calculation and biopolitical planning and correction. This articulation of sovereignty biopolitics becomes apparent in the state of exception because the two moments are momentarily separated. Sovereignty exercises its absolute power to enforce the state of exception and to abolish, suspend, or restrict all or most individual rights. But it does so to defend the biological life of the population, not the individual lives and rights of citizens. Let us look at this first at the treatment of refugees. The two logics I was explaining lead to opposing results. The political asylum process is individual and legal, a clear case, a mainstay of legal protection. The Greek government does not treat refugees, however, as individuals, but as a group or a horde that must be kept out or detained for the good of the local population. The exclusion of refugees protects the national body, doubly endangered by foreigners and disease. Now, as you probably know, politicians have repeatedly used the language of disease to describe migrants. They're insects, parasites, who come from scum places and infect the local population. The coronavirus is foreign or Chinese for President Trump. Foreigners are introducing it into our part of the world for Hungarian President Orban. The refugees, in that sense, are doubly dangerous. They are mobile, like viruses, and they import viruses and diseases, and for this reason must be excluded. In this utility calculus, a late version of the utilitarian felicific calculus, the individual foreign bodies have no worth because they may infect healthy local life, and this is the reason why they lose all protection. In the pandemic, this logic is extended to the entire population. The sovereign suspends individual civil, political, and economic rights in order to protect the life of the population. Immunity, the protection of the rights of citizens, the rights to life, to movement, the right to come together in meetings and so on, all these rights are abolished in order to activate the immune system of the nation. This is precisely the herd immunity strategy followed initially by Britain, Sweden, and others. What does it mean exactly? If no restrictive measures are taken, if there is no lockdown, 80% of the population, up to 80% of the population, will be infected by the virus and will acquire immunity. That is the herd immunity, the immunity of the population. But as the disease spreads, hundreds of thousands of elderly and vulnerable citizens may also get infected and die. Dominic Cummings, the Boris Johnson's most trusted advisor, told a government meeting in early February that if as a result a lot of people die, so be it. Immunity for the herd means exactly the abolition of citizen immunity. the abolition of the right to health and life for certain, quite a few, actually, individuals, a few million, the elderly and the vulnerable. At this point, now, the utility calculus I referred to earlier is reactivated around the question of the resumption of economic activity. It balances infection and possible death against the return to capitalism as we've known it, to business as usual. The more honest and cynical politicians have made this balancing clear. For German Speaker of Parliament, extremely influential politician Wolfgang Schäuble, life is not the highest value. Saving life does not have an absolute priority over the economy. For Trump, the treatment should not be worse than the disease. Texas Deputy Governor Dan Patrick was even clearer. Seniors should be willing to die in order to save the economy for the young ones, to save capitalism for the next generation. The Day Telegraph here published an article in which COVID-19 can be beneficial as it disproportionately eliminates older people. So we have a modern form of eugenics, a blood sacrifice to capitalism. The sovereign decides who will live and who will die on the altar of the market, joining biopolitics with necropolitics. So that brings us to my third thesis. Sovereignty and biopolitics, government and governance are not opponents with rights restricting state power and state policy. Both are part of a combined strategy of administering life and death that respects individual lives and rights only if they don't inhibit economic utility according to a utility calculus. Let's now move to the third part of my talk on life, death, and dying. Globalized communications and financial transactions have a single aim or value, if you want to call it: unlimited circulation, the endless production of exchange value. In that sense, they are nihilistic. They don't have any value, they don't have any aim except that endless production and circulation, production of exchange and circulation. But the same goes for the coronavirus. It spreads quickly, it does not stop at borders, it does not discriminate between people and classes. The virus circulates in the space created by globalization, but it is also a common currency and a symbol for globalized humanity. Like financial transactions, the virus has no other aim except to spread, to penetrate bodies, to kill. It is nihilistic in that sense and alerts us to the relationship between life and death. The great essayist Michel de Montaigne entitled one of his absolutely amazing essays, "To study philosophy is to learn to die." I quote, "The premeditation of death is the premeditation of liberty. He who has learned to die has unlearned to be subjugated." It is a rather strange idea. We're free when we contemplate and become acquainted with death, when we become conscious of what brings consciousness to an end. The pandemic, I believe, helps us understand this statement in the context of this discussion, the things I was talking about earlier. The declarations of rights, from the French Déclaration des droits de l'homme to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, start with the statement that people are born free and equal, in a sense one of the most important symbolic statements of human rights. Unfortunately, this is a comforting and soothing lie. We're not born equal, but unequal. The baby born in Hampstead or in a favela in Brazil has a totally different life from that born in East Ham and or a nice place of Rio de Janeiro. Let me put it again. The baby born in Hampstead or in a rich part of Rio de Janeiro has a totally different life from that born in East Ham or favela. This is what I was saying, not having an audience here to tell me that my statement was wrong. I had to think about it myself. Now, both these sets of people will die where they were born, either physically in Hampstead or East Ham, or metaphorically. In other words, the advertised upward social mobility is, to a very large extent, pretty imaginary. Only about 10% of people move upwards in any substantial way during their life. So we're born unequal, but we all die equally. Birth distinguishes, death equalizes. We're equal because we're mortal. It is the equality of death, I would say, that motivates the struggle for equality and equal rights. Death is a part of life and has a sovereign right over it. But the pandemic reminds us that dying, which is part of life, the road to death is the most unequal and uneven path. It is no coincidence that the Black Lives Matter protests are taking place in the midst of the pandemic. George Floyd was Black and poor. He combines in his body class, race, and state brutality. He had lost his job and the police was called because he allegedly used a counterfeit banknote to buy cigarettes. A Brazilian friend once told me that the virus arrives by air with the rich travelers and kills the poor in the favelas. If you have no water, how can you wash your hands? If you live in a room with lots of others or in a refugee camp, how to keep physical distance? Minorities and the poor are up to 4 times more likely to die than others. So while death equalizes, the road to death, as I put it, dying, precisely shows the huge inequalities for the poorer part of the population, the class difference, but also for ethnic minorities. So where do we go from here? What about resistance in the state of exception? Governments have been violating all kinds of rights and have restricted democracy. On the whole, people have complied with emergency measures. And of course, the success in this pandemic, the success in limiting infection is our success, the success of people who physically distance precisely in order to act with social solidarity. It was not a social distancing, it was a physical distancing. And we implemented it in order precisely to help the social bond. But at the same time, we must constantly remind the authorities that they are not entitled to suspend our rights, to suspend our immunity, or to extend the suspension after the end of the emergency. We did not ask for the abolition of the restrictions, but we should not stop emphasizing the wrongness. According to the principle, we condemn the restrictions on freedom, but no one should violate them. People are resisting all over the world. The wonderful Black Lives Matter protests have put on the agenda, on the political agenda, the question of racism and of public memory. In 2010, we entered a period that I call the period of resistances. We had a series of resistances that started in the Arab Spring, moved to Europe, Spain, Greece, and then all over the world, and of course, Occupy Wall Street. That period, that age of resistance, I think the first major long period of resistance since the 1960s has been reactivated. People resist. They will go on resisting. We don't know where the next major insurrection and set of protests and resistances will take place, but we know that it will take place. Now, people resist, however, not because they have legal rights. By definition, they have been suspended or abolished in this period, but because there is another kind of right, the right of the governed. And here I'm using a term that Foucault in his late lecture series develops. This right of the governed is not legal, it is not inalienable, it is not natural, it is not eternal, nor does it derive from the sovereign as the major legal rights, civil and political rights do. It expresses the independence of the governed, and it shows it is our own willingness, our will, the will of the governed to resist acts that go against their interests and their community. These rights are produced at specific historical moments by collectivities of the governed and are used strategically when people revolt and try to defend themselves. Rights exist because we resist, and this is the reason why the authorities respect them. Rights survive because we invoke and use them. No constitution, no law can guarantee any rights. Let me therefore conclude. There are two types of rights, the rights of law and the rights of the street. Without disobedience and resistance, none of the legal rights we take for granted would have been born or survived. The language of rights, therefore, is not just about laws and constitutions and international conventions and human rights. It is a language that exists also in the street and can be used to challenge the existing legal order, not just to demand to have a place within the existing legal and political order. Therefore, I'm coming here to my fourth thesis. We do not stop criticizing legal rights for their inadequacy, their individualizing and depoliticizing effect, for their use to legitimize state power. But we do not stop insisting that nobody should be without rights. More generally, to finish, I would say that the pandemic reminds us of three or four things. First, human and social vulnerability. It makes us sensitive. It reminds us of our mortality, of our finitude, something we had forgotten in the previous period of narcissistic individualism and consumerism. Second, it reminds us, or it makes it absolutely clear, that inequality kills. It makes a huge difference. Inequalities, class difference, race differences make a huge difference in terms of health, of well-being, in terms of mortality. Third, we all now know, even those who were totally against the public goods and public services, how central they are, particularly the National Health Service, which had been so much devalued and underfunded all over Western Europe and, of course, the United States in the previous period. Finally, we have been reminded of the importance of solidarity, the importance of collectivity, of being together, the calm of community, instead of the commode of commodity. This solidarity, this collectivity, the public goods, public, the health service, state, the importance of equality and social justice. These are all progressive values, progressive institutions. They come from the tradition and the legacy of the left. Governments were obliged to honor them, while they're totally against them ideologically. They even had to implement them in order precisely to save the population. Our task, however, the task of the left, is to change those provisional values, the application of those provisional values into permanent, to take all this experience of the pandemic and the state of exception and the responses it has created and make them back again into the heart and the foundation of a new post-pandemic democratic and social community. This is something that this critical theory summer school has been talking about and discussing over the last 7 or 8 years. I hope we will again be together and discuss them in the near future next year. For the time being, I sign off, and I'm looking forward to have a discussion about this and other matters in the live session at some point in July. Thank you very, very much.